I mean, it attempts to justify eventually having to put Fial down and take him to, a farm upstate. Hey guys, welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair, a global Witcher podcast. My name is Alyssa from Good Morn, and I'll be your host as you, I, and our international Hansa accompany Geralt of Rivia and his destiny, Cyrilla of Sintra, across the continent. So I have very exciting news for you all. I know I've been teasing a special episode during the break. I am so excited to announce, I can't even believe I'm saying this, I'm so excited to announce that Doug Cockle, the voice actor for Geralt of Rivia in the Witcher video games with CD Projekt Red, and Peter Kenny, guys, I'm screaming, and Peter Kenny, the audiobook narrator for the Witcher series in English, will both be on the podcast meeting for the first time this April. Guys, I'm so excited. They have never met before. This is going to be the first time that they're ever meeting. And I am so excited to share this with the community and to bring this conversation to life. So if you guys have any questions for Doug and Peter, please let me know ahead of the episode. We'll be recording in just a couple of weeks, and you can expect that episode in early April. We'll be talking about voice acting across different mediums, video games, audiobooks, and more, The Witcher, of course, and you'll also get a sneak peek at our upcoming audio fiction series, Peculiar Radio, during the episode. Make sure you're keeping an eye on social media for the exact release date of the episode and find it across your podcatchers as well as YouTube in April. I don't even know where to go from there. That's so insane. Guys, I'm so excited. I can't believe this is happening. That being said, this is the last episode of Season 4. Thank you guys so much for joining me over the last 13 months as I've gone through The Witcher Season 2 on Netflix, The Witcher Blood Origin, The Witcher Nightmare of the Wolf, and we're going to come back next full season of Breakfast in Beauclair on Thursday, July 6th, 2023, with Season 5 of the podcast covering Andrzej Sapkowski's Time of Contempt. Over the break, make sure to keep in touch with the Hansa on Discord at bit.ly/the Hansa Discord, on Instagram or TikTok at Breakfast in Beauclair, and on Twitter at BeauclairPod. So have a great spring, guys. Oh, that feels so good to say. Have a fantastic spring and early summer. Thank you so much for the birthday wishes, which I know are coming at the end of February. And I will see you in Australia and New Zealand in April. Guys, I'm so glad to be done, and I'm so excited to come back in July. But before we go, we've got a full episode for you guys. So that starts with our patron announcements. Welcome Deanna and Rivia Vengerberg to our Hansa on Patreon. And thank you as always to everyone who's supported the show over Season 4. And of course to our patrons, reduced level patrons, Louise of Covier, the owner of the Turlish Porpoise, Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob B, Ava of Gullet, B Haven of the Edge of the World, Charlotte from Eggerberg Glamour, Red Kite, the Original Roach, Connor's Cat, Libby, John of Riblia, Tom from Australia, Jill Kate the Tabby Witch, Ollie from Sweden, James Carson III, Salas Hybe Sorcerer, a Toussaint Knight, Miriam of Temeria, and Softy. Between seasons of the show, catch up on all 40 patron-only posts, which include things like our Patreon-exclusive quiz show, The Quiz of Surprise, deleted scenes from previous episodes, and even highlights from Andrzej Sapkowski's Q&A at Luca Comics and Games Festival in 2019. As for this episode, Danny from the US and Lucie from London call in for Netflix's The Witcher Blood Origin, episode 104 of Mages, Malice, and Monstrous Mayhem. Join us as we discuss the thesis of Blood Origin, the public reception to the show, how Ithlinne's prophecy has come to pass, how Blood Origin expands on the Witcher universe, and the limited series' impact on our bridge characters, Jaskier and Avallac'h. In our mid-episode news segment, Tidings and Toussaint, Larson Witcherflix shares some insights into Season 3 of The Witcher on Netflix and the new spin-off series we can expect in the coming years. Without further ado, let's get to the last episode of the season with our discussion of Netflix's The Witcher Blood Origin, episode 104 of Mages, Malice, and Monstrous Mayhem. Hey everyone, welcome to Breakfast in Beauclair. My name is Alyssa, and today we're welcoming 2 new members of our Hansa to the show. My first guest is a visual effect editor on feature films, hailing from Los Angeles, California. My second guest works in marketing and communications in the UK and is currently finishing the first draft of her first fantasy novel. Please welcome Danny from the US and Lucie from London. Hey guys.
Hello.
Hi, I'm so excited to have you both and to close out season 4 of Breakfast in Beauclair with you guys. It has been a long 13 months, and I'm so excited to be here with you guys at the finish line. But before we get into our episode discussion, I would love to hear from you both. Classic Breakfast in Beauclair question. How did you both get into the Witcher series?
My wife got into it leading into the Netflix series. She knew that there were books, decided to read the books right as the first season was released. And from there, I knew that there was a set of games, and started playing Witcher 3 Wild Hunt during the lockdowns, and she would kind of play over my shoulder and make sure that I stuck to lore accurate choices, specifically with the romancing. And from there, I read the books as well. Have played through all of Witcher 3, and now I am slogging through Witcher 1 slowly but surely.
Yeah, Carrie's really out here doing the Lord's work, making sure that
Yes.
you don't get the terrible ending at the end.
I got into it because my sister was watching it, and I remember the first thing I saw was the Kikimora coming out, and I had a massive jump scare because I have a lot of jump scares, and I think I've seen that episode like 2 or 3 times since, and I still jump at that moment, even though I know it's coming, obviously. And I decided to read the books.
Amazing. How was it jumping in from the show to the books?
I mean, it was quite interesting. I'm reading them in the order in which they are meant to be read, which I don't think is necessarily the order in which they are meant to be published. I think that the biggest thing for me was the first book, with the fact that they kept referring to magic as force rather than chaos. And then I was wondering whether there was some sort of like Star Wars IP thing that happened, or if like it was like true to the original Polish. It's always interesting to see how they adapt something. So that's been really fascinating, like seeing how they change like things like the Triss character. Big fan of those changes.
Out of curiosity, are you reading the books in English or in another language?
No, so I'm reading them in English, and then for Christmas I got the French, the 3 short stories that they did drawings for.
Ah, yeah.
So I got those ones.
Those are so beautiful.
They're really stunning. Yeah, I got these one in French, and then my parents read them, and now they're watching The Witcher, so that's quite fun to see them go through it.
Lovely. Actually, I have 2 or 3 of those as well, also in French. I feel like I've been just collecting Witcher books in French, in Italian. I might as well just go get them in other languages because they're beautiful editions. I believe, I'm going to butcher this, so you correct me if I'm wrong. It's something like Braglione is the name of the publisher. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's pretty close.
Okay.
That is quite accurate.
Listeners, if you're interested in looking them up, they're beautiful, beautiful editions. I don't believe there are any in English yet, but I do know that they are in French, as well as a number of other European or Eastern European languages as well. But that's really exciting. I'm glad that you got into it, that you found us as well, and that you're enjoying your dive into The Witcher. And Danny, you're working as a visual effect editor in Los Angeles, and you've worked on a couple of titles that people will have known. Do you mind telling us what some of those are and like what work you've done on them?
So most recently, I finished on Spirited, the Christmas musical comedy that recently was released on Apple TV Plus with Ryan Reynolds and Will Ferrell. Prior to that, in terms of visual effects editing, I was on Venom, The Tomorrow War. The Dark Tower was my first visual effects editing gig, which is an interesting one when it comes to adaptations and whatnot. And then probably my favorite so far that I worked on as a visual effects editor was It Chapter 2. It was a really fun crew and movie to work on. And then prior to visual effects editing, I was a visual effects coordinator and worked on Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and some other stuff.
Visual effects is something that I'm incredibly interested in, but would never kind of like touch with like a 10-foot pole. It seems so complicated, but so incredibly beautiful and so rewarding. What has been like one of the most memorable sequences of your career to like work on?
Probably on It Chapter 2, there is a scene in which Pennywise kind of comes out of darkness and murders a little girl.
I hate everything about this. I almost spat out my tea.
And part of that was it was a sequence. So when I do visual effects editing, it involves tracking shots, doing temp visual effects as we're kind of putting the movie together, and then cutting in and the final work from vendors who are actually doing the work. So in this sequence in It Chapter 2, I kind of took a lead on kind of animating this like firefly that draws the girl underneath bleachers at a baseball game, revealing Pennywise from the darkness and things like that. So that was kind of a fun one to own that process from the beginning, and then how that played out for when the vendors actually did the work with the firefly and everything like that.
Very cool. I hate horror movies. And I suspect that if like you're constantly kind of looking at it, almost frame by frame, you kind of, get over that. But man, I just the thought of like having to edit something like that just is stressful for me.
Yeah, I wouldn't consider myself a horror fan either. I often don't work with the sound on because it's such a visual thing, and I'll listen to music while I'm like doing work or something like that, but you'll hear like kind of the jump scares and screams down the hall from like the lead editor and all that kind of stuff where you're like, oh yeah, that's still going on on this movie.
Yeah. I'm glad that we're all in the like Wikipedia is the superior way to get through anything crew. I admire that about us. And I think we're right. I think we are uniformly and supremely right. Lucie, I'd love to turn the conversation over to you. You mentioned that you're currently working on the first draft of your first fantasy novel. Congratulations. Is there anything that you can tell us a little bit about it? Or if it's still under wraps, tell us, I guess, why fantasy, why this novel?
I got the idea during the pandemic. During the pandemic, I read a lot of both fantasy and romance because I needed something that was escapism. And then I got an idea which I couldn't shake off. So I think I started writing last year, and I've got about 5,000 words on my draft, and then I need to edit. It's a story about writers, so it's very much a story about books and about how real fantasy books can be, with a slight like detective side to it, because that's what I like reading. I mean, I'm very much writing for myself. Like in the end, I want to enjoy the process. That's what matters. Yeah, so that's where I am at the moment.
Ah, that's so exciting. So what are you kind of looking ahead to when it comes to continuing this process?
Editing it?
Yeah.
Because at the moment I'm at this stage, right? Like, so it's the first draft.
Sure.
So that means it's a bit of a, Swiss cheese draft. There's a lot of insert dialogue, insert extract, like don't forget the cat, because I've got a cat who's really important, but sometimes I write a scene and then I get to the end of the scene and I'm like, oh, where was the cat? So I've got to go back and, add back the cat. You can see, okay, this is a terrible thing to say on a podcast, I'm sorry, but basically behind me, there's a lot of post-it notes. And if you saw like the room I'm in, basically it's like I'm living among post-it notes, which is both the story structure and then also stuff that I'm going to need to pay attention to during rounds of edits.
Huh, that's such a fascinating look into the process. And I feel like that's something that I've been exploring too as I've been working on an audio fiction series. I'm sure Dania has that in the line of work too. It's just like, where's the cat? And it's like, where's the thing that we need to include? Where did it go? Oh no. Yeah, I can think of examples of that in Peculiar Radio as well. And that's such a fun way of putting it. So today, we'll conclude our discussion of Netflix's The Witcher Blood Origin with episode 104 of Mages, Malice, and Monstrous Mayhem, in which Merwin forges an uneasy alliance to achieve her plans for Elfkind. The battle begins in Zintrea, Ayla finds her voice, and Fial loses control. Here's a quick synopsis of the episode from future unsick Alyssa. Woo! In episode 104, Merwin sends Balor, Eredin, and a scouting party into a new world. There, Balor betrays them, finally making his true sacrifice of Fenric and unlocking his access to chaos magic, sending Eredin into the void between worlds. Disguised, the Seven sneak into Zentreia and begin a lowborn rebellion against the Empire. They fight their way through the palace as the lowborn cause chaos in the streets. Fial is brought before Merwin, where she reveals her betrayal of the clans to him. His anger causes him to transform in the throne room. He kills the guards and takes on Balor's beast. Ayla and Merwin finally meet. After pitting their philosophies against each other, Ayla stabs Merwin and leaves her to die. Merwin makes her way to the ravaged throne room where she pulls the knife from her body and bleeds to death on the throne. With his new mutations, Fial is able to slay Balor's beast at the expense of his self-control. He is ultimately killed by Ayla, fulfilling Ithlinne's prophecy, quote, "A great beast born shall be slain by your blade." Balor returns to Zentreia with chaos magic and goes toe-to-toe with Jaskier and Sindral. With Zachariah's help, Sindral merges himself with Balor and uses their combined powers to shatter the monolith, killing them both. The power released causes the conjunction of the spheres and the merging of worlds. After the battle, Brian mourns Eredin, who is lost between worlds, Skian is reunited with her ancestral sword, Zacharay and Brother Death return to their forest and honor Sindral, and Ayla says goodbye to Fial before returning to Innistuv with Meldorf. There, Ithlinne gives the next great prophecy. The time of the spheres is upon us. Enshe, lost across skies, cast adrift in time, ever searching for love lost and left behind. The lark's seed shall carry forth the first note of a song that ends all times, and one of her blood shall sing the last. In the present, Jaskier's return to the Temerian camp with the story of the Seven. Through Sindral's Book of Monoliths, Avallac'h discovers that, beyond travel to new worlds, the monoliths may also be capable of traveling through time. In a mid-credits scene, it's shown that Avallac'h had successfully traveled to Season 1 Sintra. So now that we've gotten the episode synopsis from future voiceover Alyssa, I would love to hear some of your thoughts on this finale episode. So things we could talk about include like the story of the plot, production, casting, and ultimately I would really like to hear your highlights and lowlights of episode 104.
I saw someone in the Hansa, actually it might have even been Lars on Witcher Flicks, how kind of short this episode actually is.
Yeah.
And it just kind of flies by. And I start thinking about, all right, separating this episode out as its own individual piece. And it's really just kind of the climax of the whole show. Like all the action beats are, I think, a lot of fun. That was certainly a highlight of kind of going through the hallways and getting the pieces in place for the true kind of final battles between Sindral, Zacharay, and Balor, and then Fial and the Beast.
Mm-hmm.
All of that kind of getting to those points, I thought were a lot of fun and worked really well, if not maybe a little fast,
Yeah.
as is the refrain on the show in general. But yeah, I think those were certainly a highlight for myself watching it.
I think for me going into it, I mean, because it's the last episode and I did not read spoilers beforehand because I was like, I wanted to go because I was preparing for this. I wanted to go into the whole show and like actually discover it. Like, you know, people who don't read spoilers would. You pretty much know that some of them are going to die, right?
Right.
So for me, there was this like, oh, who is it going to be? I had some like inkling. I was really surprised on rewatch this morning. I think I've seen it 3 times to discover that Brother Death does not die. Like in my head, he was like dead, and then I was like, oh no, okay, cool. So more people survived than I thought. My main highlight is, and I rewatched it today, and I was really, it's that shot of Merwin, the Empress, when she dies. I'm really like, you know, that hair and makeup, but also the way that it's like framed so that you don't see, because her crown, like, you know, she puts back the crown, but the crown is like, it's a bit torn, it's a bit bent because of Balor's beast, I guess. And the way it's framed, and you can't see that, and like the whole echo of that with the whole thing about, you know, like writing your own story and her making her own choice and how messed up these choices might be. That was really cool. Her hair and makeup, like the golden of it all. So that was my highlight.
It's interesting too that the shot of Merwin and her death, a little bit before that, when Ayla and Merwin first square off, that shot in particular is kind of seared in my brain because it's very squared up. The two of them are in the kind of thirds of the frame, and it's just very mano a mano, if you will, of these two forces coming together, and we all kind of have a pretty good idea of how that's going to progress, but it sits on that shot just enough to really kind of hammer that home, I felt like.
Absolutely. I think that some of the characters within the Seven had a really satisfying conclusion, or at least a very satisfying confrontation that they were walking into with episode 4. So I do think Merwin and Ayla, that was something that, albeit while it was short, did feel satisfying because it exemplified not only the, I guess, the phantom that they were to each other. Like for Merwin, Ayla was this, this thing that was going around sweeping up the people, and then later she finds out was a lover to her lover. Whereas for Ayla, Merwin is her lover's ex and also the person who has brutally slaughtered everybody that she knows and loves. I think that for the two of them specifically, that felt like a appropriate confrontation for how their storylines have been built. I think Sindral and Balor was a really nice way to close off, I think, both of their stories, in my opinion, with their deaths and with Sindral being the one to stop what he had started and Balor kind of getting his comeuppance regardless of the power that he had. Both of those felt appropriate. I would have loved to see something more complete, I think, for all of the other characters. But I feel like it was kind of that question of like, given the time of what we had, I don't know how much time we could have spent really digging into all of the nuances of what they were up to and why. But we saw like some resolution in that montage at the end. It was good. I would have liked to see, I think, more of that story and a little bit more resolution.
Yeah, I think with the other characters, part of the problems you run into, for instance, with Brother Death and Zachary, that you maybe didn't get enough on the front end, and thus the kind of payoff on the back end, it's hard to kind of truly pay that off. Where it's like, for me, I was satisfied with Brother Death not dying.
Yeah.
And when I did think he was dead, it did affect me enough because I was like, oh, I like this character. I liked, oh, if we're going to do another spinoff like him and Meldoff, like Legolas and Gimli show of
Yes.
Buddy Flick would be fun. Their action and all that was fun to watch and satisfying in that way, even if there wasn't serious character work laid out. I mean, certainly more for Meldoff than Brother Death, as we learned that some of his introduction got chopped out of the show. Whether or not that would have made me feel one way or another about his death fake out so much, it did make me think about whether or not they do have intention to carry on any of these characters from into something else, because I feel like you leave him dead if you have no intention of that, because what does it matter? It like you get the heavy beat of him dying kind of so suddenly, and then, well, we don't have to worry about bringing back a character that maybe people liked in the future because we're not doing anything in the future. So that I think is kind of an interesting choice.
Yeah. I know both of you already brought up Brother Death's fake death, and it did impact me as well because we just saw Ithlinne, Mighty Cock, get completely ripped to smithereens by Fial, and I was kind of like, oh. And I think that it's there purposefully to prime you for Brother Death's single punch knockout.
But that was so shocking. Like,
Yeah, exactly.
every time I see it, I'm like, whoa. Like, even more so than, for instance, the kids dying 2 episodes before.
Absolutely. Well, because I think the stakes are much different. Our investment in those characters is much different. Yeah, I understand the reason for why it's there, to kind of justify that ultimate sacrifice that Ayla and Fial have at the end of the episode. I was not prepared for it on my first watch. I still just like skip right past it on the little Netflix skip button. I'm like, I don't need that gore in my life. I'm good without it.
I'll jump in with my very VFX-ness on this. First, the kind of creature design sort of work, Valor's Beast, and then what I kind of perceive as a Pale Widow, as referred to in kind of the game, the centipede-looking thing. That it's interesting how, even in the case of the Pale Widow, they gave it something new than we've seen, at least in the game side. So the kind of anglerfish bit is kind of a new, fun way to add something new. And then with Valor's Beast, to me, the design felt very like, let's throw as many things at it as possible. And so you get this kind of beast-like core with like dragonfly wings almost, and then the like zapping.
The space lasers felt like a bit of an overkill for me. Like that, I think that's where I was like, I don't know if I can get on board with the space lasers.
And it's just interesting from a like creature design standpoint of how do you make something new while also maybe trying to stay in a language about what that is new. When I worked on the Tomorrow War, the aliens in that, like it was a struggle to kind of like, how do you give something new, but also create something that's also like believable in a world or whatever, so that when you actually do the visual effects, it looks real enough to that world and just doesn't look fake. It's a tough balance between giving an audience something that they can like mentally refer to and something new that is believably, in this case, it's like extremely overpowered. And I think in this case also to justify Fial becoming what he becomes. Like, how do you justify getting crazy with merging a monster, whatever, DNA with an elf in order to defeat this monster if it's not able to zap people into smithereens? So, I mean, I found all that kind of interesting, even if the, creature design on the beast was kind of like, weird. Like I get where they're coming from on that. The Fial kind of transformation I did not love. And I get why they did it. And it's a lot shorter on a second time around. He's not like hulked out nearly as long as like it's seared in my brain, which is, I think, good that it's not nearly as long, because then, it's like, it just felt like, oh, why did we do this? Like changing his voice and like doing all of that. I get why you do it. You do it because you have to then justify having to kill him. It also plays out in the future time past this of like Witchers as monsters. Like we're so used to Geralt, who's the, turns all of that on its head character, but we don't really always see Witchers as the monsters that humans see them as. So I think it does help with that, as cheesy as it plays out. It has a point at least, and so I get that. It's and for the most part, it's actually impressive work, because I actually wasn't sure right away if it was digital effects or and it's CG effects. It was shown in the like behind the scenes thing of like him without shoulders because they were putting it on. I'm like, oh, it wasn't like rubber or something like that.
Yeah, I think they did have rubber suits. I think I saw that on Instagram with the costuming department. So maybe it was kind of like in stages.
Okay, yeah, because in the behind the scenes, they definitely were like hulking him out, or like showing midway between what was shot and where it was going. So that explain. I mean, if they use practical kind of reference, that makes sense too, and that's usually how you help things look realer, or at least tangible.
Yeah, probably a combination of both, or at least when he's like slightly bigger in the palace, in the throne room, versus when he's like amassed and just full refrigerator.
I'm definitely referring to the latter part, because I think everything up to that plays fine. Like it's all good. Like I'm okay with how he is through all of that, like wild animal sort of thing, and kind of playing it that way. All perfectly fine.
Yeah, when he Bruce Banners,
Yes,
that's probably where
absolutely.
where the CGI comes in.
all right.
I think for me, like those two specific instances, the creature design is something that I think I might have brought up in episode 101 with Softy and Ben, possibly also throughout our discussions in this block as well. But the creature design is something I go back and forth on because like it feels too different and too bionic and too not cyberpunk, but like too electric for the world. But at the same time, it's not meant to be from the world. So I understand like that difference, but I feel like I would have liked to see something I think a little bit more organic than something that I could see being out of like Atlantis, the Lost Empire. On Fial's side and the effects that were done there, I do agree that it asks that question when we look at those 1200 years of like, okay, if this is what the proto Witcher was and how unhinged and uncontrollable he was, this is kind of the reason. This is what happened to create all of the rules and all of the refinement for the Trial of the Grasses in the future. So I feel like it does pull, Geralt's, Vesemir, and all of those other Witchers into direct contrast with Fial then, to see how that process has been like refined and tamed into something that's much more manageable. Before we continue our discussion, we're going to hand it over to Lars Winterflix for recent news on the Netflix show.
Hey, it's Lars from Winterflix, and this is Tidings from Toussaint. Welcome back, everybody. The post-production for Season 3 of The Witcher main show is well on its way, but there's almost next to nothing to report at the moment about the new season. Therefore, this is a good time to sum up what we already know about The Witcher Season 3. As confirmed by Netflix, the new season is currently set to release in summer 2023. We know that this will be Henry Cavill's final season as Geralt of Rivia. From Season 4 on, he will be replaced by Liam Hemsworth. The filming for Season 3 took place in several countries in Europe and Africa: Italy, Slovenia, Croatia, Morocco, and the production's homeland of the United Kingdom. Season 3's official synopsis reads as follows. As monarchs, mages, and beasts of the continent compete to capture her, Geralt takes Ciri of Sintra into hiding, determined to protect his newly reunited family against those who threaten to destroy it. Entrusted with Ciri's magical training, Yennefer leads them to the protected fortress of Aretusa, where she hopes to discover more about the girl's untapped powers. Instead, they discover they've landed in a battlefield of political corruption, dark magic, and treachery. They must fight back, put everything on the line, or risk losing each other forever. About adapting the book Time of Contempt into Season 3, showrunner Lauren Hiswick has the following to say. What is so interesting is that Season 3, to me, is the closest thing that we've done as a one-to-one adaptation of the books. Obviously, we can't do every page, but Time of Contempt gave us so many big action events, plot points, defining character moments, huge reveals of a big bad. There's so much to do that we were able to stick really, really closely with the books. Fittingly, we already know that Season 3's first episode will be called Shor Ararat. This is the name of a legendary elven palace in Cadwyn that got destroyed by the elves themselves to prevent humans from entering it hundreds of years before the time of Geralt. In one of the later chapters of the book Blood of Elves, Geralt and Ciri have a very interesting scene in the ruins of Shor Ararat. It looks like we will see this moment on screen next season. Moreover, we can expect more than only a handful of new characters in Season 3 of The Witcher. Among the most important new roles in the new season are Manga Zhang as Milva, Christelle Alvin as Missel, a member of a gang of criminals named the Rats, Robbie Amell as Galatine, a Scoia'tael elf created for the show, as well as Hugh Skinner as Prince Radovid, a spin on Radovid from the books and King Vesemir of Redania's brother. In addition, we can expect various new smaller characters from the books in Season 3, including several mages like Kira Metz, Margarita Loxantil, Arto Terranova or Garrett of Aelle, minor characters from the city of Gorsvelen like Fabio Sachs, or the dwarven banker Molnar Giancardi, or other well-liked book characters like the royal messenger Aplegut, an older version of Kruk and Crate, as well as Falka, one of the most feared historical characters on the continent. Again, we only have to wait about 6 more months until a new season of The Witcher will hit our TV screens. Due to a new Redanian intelligence report, we have learned a lot about one of the new Witcher spin-offs that Netflix is currently working on. After the mixed reviews for the first Witcher spin-off miniseries Blood Origin that was released back in December 2022, this report states that a spin-off about the Rats is still in development. As already said, the Rats are an infamous group of young criminals in the books and in season 3 of the main show that will play a very important role in series storyline. This new spin-off will almost definitely be a prequel, as it is set before the Rats appear in season 3 of the main show. Just like Blood Origin, the Rats prequel miniseries has the purpose of keeping us busy between the Witcher main shows season 3 and 4. But now, on to more substantial news about this spin-off. According to the Redanian Intelligence report, its current working title is Riff Raff. Moreover, it's planned to being filmed from April to September 2023 in South Africa, but mostly in the Cape Town area. So Netflix's The Witcherverse continues filming in Africa after season 3 already made a stop in Morocco. Redanian Intelligence adds that the miniseries could consist of 6 to 8 episodes. Riff Raff's showrunner is Hayley Hall. She's writer of the Witcher episodes Rare Species and Turn Your Back from season 1 and 2. Thanks to the report, we already know the show's synopsis as well. 6 teenage thieves must rely on their criminal skills as they plan the biggest heist of their careers against the most dangerous crime ring in the kingdom. Last but not least, we already know about the actors and actresses for 4 of the 6 Rats as well, as they are already cast for The Witcher Season 3 and are therefore likely to appear in the spin-off. These include Christelle Alvin as Missel, Fabian McCallum as Kaylee, Aggie Key Adams as Iskra, and Juliette Alexandra as Reeve. We don't know when Riff Raff will be released on Netflix. A release date in mid or late 2024 is possible. Anyway guys, that's it for me for today. We talk again in the next season of Breakfast in Beauclair. I hope you all stay safe and well. Until then, thanks again for listening and good luck on the path.
One of the things that I would like to talk about as we jump into an actual discussion of the episode, really looking at how the season has played out as a whole from where we started. One of the very first things that we hear in Blood Origin is Ithlinne's prophecy. If you're familiar with the Witcher lore in general, Ithlinne is a famous elven seer who we get to know through her prophecies in the Witcher series. And they have a huge impact on the books and on the main show, and we actually meet Ithlinne as a child here. In episode 1 of Blood Origin, she reveals to Ayla, "The time of the spheres is upon us. Worlds will eat worlds, emerald skies. Fire will summon a new dawn. A great beast born shall be slain by your blade. 2 apart shall become 2 as 1. The lark's most precious note shall be the key to all things, and a quest in the name of your clan will bring you redemption." So for you guys, Danny and Lucy, how has Ithlinne's prophecy come to pass over the course of the series, and did any part of its realization surprise you guys?
For me, at least, it was an expected way to kind of include her in Blood Origin, both in terms of helping kick off Ayla's journey that she may otherwise have kind of forsaken, as well as helping tie it to the main series. Kind of would have liked the final one to may have actually included at least maybe a bit more of the one we know and love, to really kind of drive that home. Whether or not it would have logically made sense in terms of timing in reference to Ayla's unborn baby, I don't know if I would have cared one way or another, because it would have, to me, felt like a satisfying thing of like, oh, like it's that thing. You know, I think it all made logical sense to include her in the way they did, and, you know, worked for me enough. So
For me, what stood out was, of course, she predicts the conjunction of the spheres. She says fire will summon a new dawn, which turns out to be Balor getting his chaos magic from somewhere in the nether sphere and like bringing it to the continent. And then that big reveal, like a great beast born shall be slain by your blade. And the assumption is, and what Ayla starts to act on, is that like, oh, this is me. I will become the Witcher. I'm going to slay Balor's beast. And the twist ends up being that the great beast born that she ends up slaying is not Balor's beast, but it's Fial. That did throw me through a loop on my first watch because I was sitting here and I was just like, okay, so Fial like just used the lance or a weapon from a statue and then just killed Balor's beast. So where does the line come in about like a great beast born to be slain by your blade? Why didn't that happen? And then, she comes in and gently carries him off to death. That was something that I think I got into my own head about on my very first watch. But yeah, she says 2 apart shall become 2 as 1. I think that there's a number of different interpretations of that. That could refer to Ayla and Fial. That could refer to Fial and the monster going through the trial of the grasses. That can refer to Ayla and Fial having a baby. That is now the 1. And then the lark's most precious notes shall be the key to all things, which I assume is about the song The Black Rose, I would assume, and how that kind of initiates the uprising. I don't know. This is how I'm kind of seeing all of this come about.
Yeah, and I think in terms of the most precious note can also play in terms of her singing down Fial from his kind of rage, berserker rage. So, I think the best prophecies are ones that can be interpreted in multiple ways, right? And in most of the cases are actually accurate in multiple ways.
Yeah, and I guess as we've kind of gotten a bit of a recap on the series through Ithlinne's prophecy, Danny, you had a question about the thesis of Blood Origin. What is the thesis in your opinions, and how might that reflect across the main series as well?
Yeah, that kind of came to my brain in terms of a lot of the discussion about the elves and, how come the elves aren't this great society that they talk about, in retrospect. And point I saw is power corrupts, and no matter who's in charge, over time you're going to become terrible anyway, one way or another. Also, along with that, the kind of rosy glasses I got mentioned in the notes as well of like the elves in the main series are like, oh, in the good old days, like when before the humans came. And then we look back in the elves, now you have dwarves in the kind of elven society are like, well, and back in our day it was a lot better, and that there's always that, oh, we were better when we were in charge, but maybe that's not the truth, that there's always degrees of terribleness.
For me, it raises a question of like, are they successful in slaying the empire? They kill off the heads, get rid of Eredin, like kill Balor, get rid of that monolith, kill off Merwin, but they don't get rid of any of the systems that are in place. So you had a society that, was racist toward dwarves, which is going to be replaced by one that is racist toward dwarves and elves. Like there's something very reductive about the Empress died, yay, but you've got no plan behind it.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious as to how this is a hopeful story. Basically, how, like, the thing that is set up at the beginning, the fact that it can't just be pain and anger that drive the elves. In The Witcher, we know the Minnie Driver character, whose name I'm not even going to try to say, when she tells Jaskier, she's like, elves can't just like rise on anger and pain. I think roughly that's what she says. And this is meant to be a hopeful story, and I really don't think it's that hopeful. They get some personal revenge, right? They also get a great deal of pain themselves, and they set up the circumstances for the fall of the elves. And obviously then I'm sure there's much more like steps between it, but I'm just really curious as to how this is meant to be the story that people are going to be like, yes, people, we got this.
Yeah. So it's interesting that you bring that up because there was an article that came out on Netflix to Doom, I think maybe like a week or 2 ago, from Declan DeBarra, who's the showrunner and the creator of The Witcher Blood Origin. And if I'm paraphrasing this correctly, he spoke about the thesis of Blood Origin being the idea of just storytelling, how powerful stories can be and where they can come from. And I can certainly see that thesis when we take a hard look at like Ayla's storyline and how her songs have like brought up the lowborn, how, as you said, Jaskier's understanding of this story will, eventually lead the elves and the Scoia'tael to do something.
So it kind of like looks ahead in that regard. There are meta moments that contribute to that. For example, when Balor, often from Balor actually, he's just like, that sounds like a good story. Oh no, you're going to create a folk tale. Like, Balor as a character almost seems to be that like mouthpiece for that meta commentary about storytelling. However, I kind of agree with you both. Like, that's not necessarily how I would define the overall thesis of Blood Origin. Um, I would probably look at it as a conversation on power and on ambition and social class and status. I would kind of be looking at it through that lens, and I think that those are themes that Blood Origin has begun or has wanted to explore. I think to varying degrees of success throughout the series. I think given Merwin, Balor, and Aroden, I think a lot of their scenes and their characters have to do with the pursuit and the corruption of power. Whereas for the Seven, we kind of get a classic, like Hansa getting the band together kind of story. That really feels like it doubles down on the found family that we've explored so much in the main Witcher series. So, yeah. And then you throw in a little bit of like political and cultural uprisings in there, and then sprinkle that in. You got Blood Origin. Now that we've spoken about some of the themes, our overall interest in the plot and the storyline, there was one specific thing that I would love to discuss with you both, and that is how this transitional period in Elven society contrasts with what we see of humans in the main series. One of the biggest critiques for how Blood Origin relates to the Witcher main series was, oh, but the elves act and curse and do all of these things that all the humans already do. So how are they really that different? How do we get Filavandrel from them? Are they just acting like humans? Do we really feel like it's a new society, a different society, a better society, if their characterization is exactly the same? So I'd love to ask you guys about that. Do you think that there is a desire or a need to have this feel like an entirely separate world in the way that the characters relate to themselves and each other?
I think the show runners themselves have the intention to bring together that humans and elves aren't actually that different. I think that's the intentional, what they're intending to do here, at least in these particular time periods. Whether or not we do explore earlier, and maybe that's a little bit more what we had in mind for this time period, I don't think that's their intent. I think there's an intentional subverting of what audience may have expected from this time period. And I think that is part of the trying to point to, like, it's a little bit of drawing the metaphor of human modern racial tension to a fantasy world of we're all the same, one way or another, even if literally the elves are a completely different, like, genetic code compared to the metaphor that it's kind of playing off of in our world. To me, that's what they're kind of trying to drive home. It's interesting because it does kind of flip on its head, where the books, and I think The Witcher as a whole, also kind of looks at it from humans looking at the other. The other maybe is not so other compared to ourselves, and so in this way it's like going both directions a little bit with that. Eventually humans aren't that different from the elves, and kind of goes both ways a little bit, and dwarves and witchers themselves maybe not being so monstrous compared to what we see with Vial.
The colonization aspect to that in that context, I thought was quite interesting. And it's interesting that you mentioned the word civilized, because that's one of the words that Merwin uses, right, when she sends Aroden's scouting party. Yeah. And then at the end, like, this idea that you have medieval, early Renaissance Europeans who obviously like big on colonization, these people. I thought that was quite interesting as well.
Yeah, and it had in my mind Merwin being very religious in a way. In our world, like going to Africa and spreading Christianity or whatever, that was very kind of, felt like there was that parallel in the way she spoke. But in Merwin's mind, it's, whatever, the culture of like, oh, I'm going to bring our art and all of that, even though in reality that maybe isn't actually being brought to or people right outside, the palace gates, and the kind of blindness that I'm going to bring this to all the worlds, but I can't even really bring it to my people.
And I'm going to take their food, right? Because like that's her real problem right now, right? She needs to find that tyrant sweet spot where like she's feeding her people enough that they are not going to rise, but also not feeding them so well that they are going to have time to, you know, think about political topics. And again, that's very much colonization. Like, you know, it's what Europeans did, right? Like they took and took and took from dozens of countries.
One also helps create like the other to fight against. So if all elves are fighting in these three kingdoms, if we come together and find somebody else to fight, and we'll take all of their resources and feed truly all of the elves on the continent as we see them, and leave everybody else behind, that becomes that new kind of focus, that driving force to bring elven society to new heights or whatever.
And I think it also offers then like a very interesting look at like this story if we're looking at it through the lens of colonization specifically. Because if we think about like all of the stories in our history of colonization, the stories that we know are like the successful ones. I'm putting quotes on that. Like we know about Great Britain, we know about Spain, we know about the Dutch, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we very rarely hear failed stories of colonization. The only one I can think of off the top of my head is Magellan trying to go to the Philippines and getting walloped on the beach by the indigenous people, and that's goodbye to Magellan. That idea that history is written by the victors, yada, yada, yada. Merwin's attempt at colonization, Balor's attempts at power, Eridan's whatever he was going along with, they all become footnotes to history ultimately because of their failures. So I feel like as we're kind of talking about colonization, all of that kind of came to mind about how it is a story of failure in that regard, and kind of begs the question of like, what is worth remembering? Like, what are we telling stories about, and what is worth putting in the annals of history? Yeah, I hadn't really thought of it in that specific regard until we started talking about colonization. But it's just like, that's a story of an L that that we're seeing here.
Well, that circles back to Lucy's kind of question of like, why would you want to bring this story to the Scoia'tael?
Right.
The elven society that you're putting on a pedestal, not so great, but it's like at the same time, it's putting the Scoia'tael as like the lowborn, as like the people rising up or the elves rising up, even if they may at the same time look back at their history as being so great. So it's like this weird kind of duality there.
Yeah, we have never in the entire course of human history evolved past the idea of social class. It's still something that defines us today. It is something that has defined dozens of civilizations globally. And when you think about it, again, in that context, that's something that has affected the lowborn elves in Blood Origin. We see that in the Witcher main series between the elves and the dwarves and ultimately the Scoia'tael. That is, I think, where the story of the Seven comes into play, as Jaskier puts it, by the end of the series. Yeah, so I'm sure that there's going to be more of that in the future as well.
On the lowborn side, I felt that their side of the story and their side of the uprising wasn't particularly well handled, because you don't really get to see much of it, and then they end up almost being that like weird tool in that plan that the Seven sort of have but don't really have, because they don't really have a plan beyond like killing those stray. For me, that was quite frustrating, the fact like I didn't feel you got much of a sense of scale either, of like how many people we're talking about. So Balor was lowborn, but is there anyone who's lowborn? Maybe Brother Death, but in the Seven.
I mean, I would assume Zachary and Syndrel as well. They might have been plucked for being celestial twins or something like that, but there's not a lot of like context around it. When we look at the series as a whole, I think a lot of it is really done on the back of Ayla's song, The Black Rose. And like, I think we hear it at least once every single episode. But I feel like that song does a lot of legwork in trying to kind of get us over the finish line of believing that there is something inherently wrong with the society. Whether or not it does that enough, it sounds like, Lucy, you have your thoughts. We probably could have seen a little bit more or felt a stronger impact throughout the plot and the story to get a better payoff.
And more of an agency. I mean, that scene where Ellie, when they open the grain vault, whatever it's called, I think it's a great scene, but it also feels quite manipulative. Like they need the lowborn to go into the castle so that the gods are going to take care of that riot rather than focus on them.
I think that's a fair critique.
Especially because when you do see them, the lowborn riot really involved in the castle, it's rushing up to Merwin, who's about to take their agency away from them as well by pulling the knife herself. Takes that kind of away from them again. One of the things that definitely drove me craziest was not seeing Baelor as lowborn enough in his introduction that it's like any chance he got, he talks about being lowborn. I'm like, man, what happened to him at some point? Like something triggered this chip on his shoulder, because that is his focus, and it just doesn't feel like it was set up well enough, especially to then use as kind of a foil for his motivation is to become the oppressor, whereas maybe the Seven are kind of helping the lowborn just kind of rise up as opposed to then be the next boot, on the next neck.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that you phrase that too, it begs the question of why him? Why is he the one who should be elevated to this idea of a god? Is it really all ego? Or is there a justifiable reason for why his skill set, his magic, his ambition should set him apart? I do agree. I think it was a lot of telling rather than showing. It'd be interesting if, for example, there was kind of a Weasley sort of quality to Baelor, where maybe his robes weren't as nice, or we had some sort of visual cue that he was not meant to be there. Baelor looked freaking awesome in every scene. He looked like he was meant to be there, so the only clues that we got that he wasn't was him being very self-pitying throughout the series. So I do agree that there was probably an opportunity to leverage him a little bit more to really drive that class narrative in a way that felt critical to his story, while also driving the underlying rebellion that we would see by episode 4. I agree with both of you on that. And I'd love to bring in this question from Michelle, who was on our last episode, which covered episode 103, now that we're at the end of Blood Origin. And she had asked, the creators of Blood Origin had the delicate task of tying in the main flagship show and the other spin-offs, but also creating a show that could stand on its own and be enjoyable without having prior knowledge of the IP. So for you guys, Danny and Lucy, do you think the results of this were successful? Do we think that Blood Origin can stand on its own, and why or why not?
I mean, so my parents just watched it, and their only knowledge of The Witcher at this point was the 3 short stories that have been illustrated into French. And they were like, yeah, it's great. We're seeing what happened before. It's very anecdotal, but I do think that some people who have zero investment of the series, not to mention the discussion of the fandom, might possibly even enjoy it more.
I would agree. I had a similar situation with my in-laws. We watched it with them, all 4 episodes pretty much straight through, and they had watched the main series at least once. They had a good time with it and had fun, and I think that's what ultimately is kind of the point with a lot of this stuff. I find discussions with fandoms in regards to adaptations is a difficult line, where the point of the adaptation for the original creator to open up their work to something like a Netflix series, a movie, whatever, is to draw more people into it as a whole. Out of 50 people, if a few are like, hey, I'm going to go read the books now because I heard their books, that's fulfilling the original creator's goal. And then there's the production company, the Netflix, the studios, whomever, their goal is to make money. And so as long as people are watching and enjoying it, will watch the next piece, whether or not they care too much how they interconnect, that's successful to them as well. I know there's all the talk that, like, bring me the action. Like, I don't care about, like, quiet moments by the fire, like, just slice everybody up. So I think the pacing, works for that broader audience where maybe the fans are looking for something more.
I would agree with you both that it can stand on its own, and it can possibly be even more successful on its own when you're not trying to draw comparisons or relation between Blood Origin and The Witcher at times. I think that, the story, the plot, and the characters are lovingly kind of self-contained, which I think works. Like, I was invested from the beginning to the end, and then also enjoyed kind of the Witcher treats I was getting throughout. Ithlinne's prophecy, references to the Witcher short stories that we saw throughout the dialogue, that sort of thing. But ultimately, there was a piece of feedback that I saw in passing on the internet that stuck with me on a second watch. I don't even know where I saw this comment. It might have been like Reddit or Twitter or whatever. It was a comment that said something along the lines of like, oh, this would be a really great D&D movie. And I was like, you know what? That's not wrong. Like, if you were looking at it in the context of just like, oh, we're getting a party together to fight the big bad. Oh, and we did it. I'm just like, yeah, you know what? That is, And I was trying to kind of get through my second watch without having that feedback in mind. When the intrusive thoughts would win and I'd be like, yeah, you know what? This would be a good D&D movie. I was like, man, yeah, it does stand on its own when you kind of look at it in that context. So that was something that, really earwormed and stuck in my mind. To an extent, I do think it is successful as a standalone show, or it can stand on its own. And then if you are a Witcher fan or you're invested in the IP in general, that there are obvious, crossovers, ties, and you can either watch the main Witcher series and not watch Blood Origin, or watch Blood Origin and not watch the main Witcher series, and you'd kind of have a more or less complete experience regardless of that. So we've talked about our thoughts on this individual episode. We've talked about the season as a whole quite a bit. And I'd love to get into that future tie-in and future prediction with the main Witcher series. And ask you guys, to what extent does the story told within Blood Origin really expand the world of The Witcher? And how might this prequel change our understanding of the main series? There's a few things that come to mind for me, specifically the conjunction of the spears, the monoliths, but also Jaskier and Avallac'h, who are kind of our little connectors between these 1,200 years in time.
Yeah, I think the obvious elephant in the room is the monoliths.
Aren't they always?
We knew that we had to explain them, and they do explain them and kind of tie that backwards. And with the conjunction, it definitely is a little bit more expository on the history more than anything to give context. Whereas I think Jaskier is maybe similarly, it's like to kind of keep fans of the main series kind of maybe invested a little bit more than otherwise to kind of draw that. But I do think they have certainly built it up in a way that Jaskier is going to show up, Song of the Seven or something like that in the main series at some point. I know you've talked about in the podcast before in terms of the Scoia'tael and their intentions, or kind of the backstory of how they kind of get played in the books is kind of shrouded a little bit. It's not super clear. And then it feels like they might be using this as a method to bring that maybe more into focus in the main series. And it'll be interesting to see if and how they actually do that. Most likely via Jaskier and telling this story in some fashion.
Clearly in the series, they've made a much bigger deal of the elves of Fringilla than happened at the same stage in the books. Danny's suggestion that they might use the story to keep that thing with the elves rising. I'm really curious how they end that elf story, because that would be such a big upheaval, right? If all of a sudden the elves like overthrow the humans. People are not happy that the first Witcher was an elf. Like, let's talk about that, right?
We'll
Like,
say proto-Witcher. Like, I think we can give them the benefit of the doubt there.
yeah, no, and I think that there's loads of ways to explain it. I can't quite figure it out.
Yeah, and I think there's a few questions that Blood Origin brings up and then just doesn't answer by the end of episode 4. I mean, I think that's one of them, like that question of like, well, we have the proto-Witcher, so we know that these experiments were considered and possible. And then what happens to the point of rediscovering them and then defining them and standardizing them as we see in Geralt's time? And I think that question also relates to like chaos magic. Is it the kind of thing that like Balor brought it to the continent, and because like it's here now, it kind of like spreads on the wind and like other people get chaos magic? Or is it something of the conjunction that people get chaos magic? Or is it lost forever with Balor and somehow people find it again over the course of those 1200 years? Like, I don't know. There's a few things that it brings up that, like, because we seem to resolve those two specific plot points with like character deaths, it's like, okay, so what now? Like, when did we actually make that transition to these things being relevant in the contemporary Witcher time? As far as like the conjunction of the spheres goes, like we saw how it occurred. So it seems like there was already some sort of fracturing that was happening with their experimentation. But it wasn't just kind of like a big bang, I think, as we have understood it from the books. It was something that was initiated by, in this case, Sindril and Balor, and their meddling. With the monoliths, I mean, it was the free space on the Hansa bingo card for a reason. We knew we were going to get monoliths in, in this series. It was part of the teaser trailers, all of that. So we knew we were probably going to get a monolith origin story in Blood Origin. And I do think it does adjust our understanding of what these are, what they do, and makes that pretty clear. I think as Softy said when we covered episode 101, he reminded me that, oh yeah, Ishtred was actually really freaking wrong about these being like impact points and stuff like that. But that is one of the cool things about having that 1200-year difference. So we actually see what they do. And yeah, they use it as a literal like space hub to open gateways to other worlds. And it has that sci-fi element to it. But it's literally a control panel, apparently. It will be interesting to see how that actually does impact our understanding of what characters in these contemporary Witcher times actually do with them. When it comes to Jaskier and Avallac'h, I'm so curious to see, as you said, Danny, like how this song and this experience is actually going to drive Jaskier as a character in season 3. We've heard from Joey Beatty that Blood Origin takes place about 6 months before, or 6 months after, or both, between seasons 2 and season 3 of The Witcher. How much of a profound impact is this going to have on him? Because we know he's been involved with the Scoia'tael.
Because you don't actually hear his song, right? His song is not embedded in the story. You've got to actually do the credits, which a lot of people are not going to do.
However, secrets.
Okay.
I do think that it's going to show up in season 3 because if you do watch the credits, Joey Beatty did that song with Joseph Trapanese, who is the composer for the main Witcher series, and not with Bear McCreary, who was the composer for Blood Origin.
And so on Spotify, they were released separately because it took me ages to figure it out. And then I had to go look for Joey Beatty to find the actual song.
Yeah, so I wonder if it already has significance in season 3 based on the composers alone. But that's me with my conspiracy board.
I mean, it's the way all of this kind of functions production-wise and logistically. It's certainly it's a pretty logical conspiracy theory to come to.
Yeah,
that completely makes sense. That we worked with this composer because we're working on this part. We can also use it over here in some way. In one of the Tidings things that had been floating around the Hansa, Declan had said something about the songs not necessarily really being part of the story to begin with. And then it kind of grew into its own thing. It makes me wonder how much that's also the case with not just Ayla's songs, but also in Jaskier's work.
Yeah. So I was watching the credits this morning because I was looking for a song, like the title of a song that they ultimately didn't end up mentioning, but at least I got this intel from that extra 30 seconds of my life I spent watching the credits. But it does list Joseph Trabanese and Joey Beatty, lyrics by Declan DeBarra, who is the showrunner of Blood Origin, as well as one of the writers on at least The Witcher season 1 and 2. I'm not sure if he's in the writing room for season 3 as a staff writer. But yeah, so I think it's entirely plausible that, maybe it did come from season 3 back to Blood Origin.
The song is as much about the fact that it got forgotten as about the existence of those people, right?
I believe so. Yeah, I believe so. I haven't read the lyrics super, super closely, but I do know that it does. The chorus just always wiggles into the brain. And the last connecting piece between Blood Origin and the main series is really Avallac'h. We learn very quickly in the last episode that not only do monoliths offer travel between worlds, but they also have the capability to help the user travel between times. He presents this to Merwin, nothing comes of it, and then in the post-credits scene, we see that he has successfully traveled to season 1 Sintra. I mean, without too many book spoilers, we can chat offline later if we want, but without too many book spoilers for the listening community, what do you guys think is going on there?
It's funny that Lucy mentioned, the song being part of the credits and how many people actually watch the credits. I'm someone who normally does, but in the way that we were watching this with family, I completely missed the mid-credits tag originally in the first watch through. And then I think I saw some article or something refer to it. I'm like, wait, what? Like, Carrie and I rewatched it more recently, make sure we watch this bit. And it's interesting to me. I know there were conversations in the Hansa about reuse of the specific Siri footage.
Yeah.
Questions as to whether or not Avallac'h was there at the same time we then see Geralt was there, or potentially nobody there the very first time Siri looked up, whether or not that actually has any real implications. I'm certainly of the mindset, especially when it comes to like post-credit sequences or whatever, that they're gonna use what footage functions more than anything.
Yeah.
And having Freya, young as she is there, and how young she specifically looks from season 1 was probably the main reason they used that.
Yeah. Or just the idea that she looks up.
It functions for all of that, then allows you to kind of be like, oh, I'd have to re-look at it. Guessing based off of the conversation the Hansa made on Avallac'h, it may literally be the same kind of doorway that she looks towards.
So when I rewatched it, it's not super clear. It actually, because Geralt was standing fully in a doorway at the end of the hall. That's what I think we get in season 1. Whereas it's hard to tell where Avallac'h is because it looks like they just recreated what needed to fit in the camera. And then you actually didn't get any shots of him in the larger scene, which I think makes sense from a production standpoint. He could have been somewhere else entirely, just within Ciri's point of view. It doesn't necessarily mean he and Geralt were standing on top of each other at any given point in various multiverses or whatever. So I don't know.
It's often, especially when you get into reshoots and whatnot, it's always, hey, let's find a background plate for this and then we'll shoot on green screen. So to me, again, without looking too heavily into it yet, it feels like that's an easy solution of hey, let's do this thing. We'll use footage we already really have, throw Avallac'h on a green screen and comp them in and call it a day sort of thing. That's kind of where my brain went, is the more technical part of that. The one thing I hope for, and I know it's not going to happen, is some sort of reference in the series to Avallac'h's initial appearance in Wild Hunt.
Yes, that is a very specific appearance. Without saying too much, for those of you who've not played Wild Hunt or finished the books as well. Yeah, I'm curious about Avallac'h just because he wasn't necessarily someone who I expected to see. The production kept the character very, very under wraps prior to the release of the show. There was very little indication that we would see an additional character tie-in to the main series at all from Blood Origin. So without giving anything away from the books for any of you new readers out there, Avallac'h does have some importance, as the post-credit scene would imply. What that importance is, I'm probably not going to say, but I will be curious based on what we know about some of the other characters from this time period, for example, Eridan, or just the Wild Hunt in general, which we, again, kind of allude to when we see him pick up the mask that we later see in season 2 of The Witcher. Like, I wonder if they're going to keep Avallac'h at his current age. I wonder if they're going to recast him or age him up. I just have no idea how this Avallac'h is going to be used. So that's something that I have a lot of questions about that I'm looking forward to seeing, in future seasons of the main series.
It could be quite a long-term thing. Like, we could be seeing him in season 3. They could insert him. I'm at the point of the book just before he turns up in a big way, which I know because I read the Wikipedia entry. But yeah, so it could be like 2 or 3 seasons before we have a chance to see him again, right?
Yeah. And that, I think, plays into the casting side of it, of current guy who's playing Avallac'h is like, what kind of deal did you sign? And are you going to have to sit around and wait? Actually, not just a couple of years, but potentially 5+ years before you get called up again. Also plays into whether or not they might do additional spin-off stuff that he could be part of, whether or not, not knowing what the next anime is going to be about. Like, do you utilize this actor that you've cast in other ways than just the main series, and a character that is being presented to have kind of an overarching impact in series life and somehow that we don't necessarily know yet? Do you sprinkle that in elsewhere to kind of tease what may or may not be coming, depending on what they actually adapt?
Yeah.
So it's all kind of interesting as to, there's so much, especially with how spread out the seasons have been. Production logistics, post-production logistics play into some of those sort of choices that may be forced on them down the line.
Yeah. And I think the casting question also deserves to be looked at again, just because now we know that Avallac'h is capable of not just traveling through space, but also traveling through time. There could be an infinite amount of time between when we see him now and the next time that we see him. Is that reason to recast, for example? Or do we see him at various points along his current time? Or do we see him differently throughout the series at different points in his timeline now that we've thrown all the timey-wimey stuff in there? I feel like it's like Doctor Who rules. Like, you can pop the time machine a second later, but have lived an entire life in that period. So it's like, ooh.
It's also very Umbrella Academy, I feel like.
Yes. Yeah. Love that show.
Where they stuck 5. They, for the most part, stick with him as a kid, as the actor, even though he's lived this like insanely long life. It becomes a whole other kind of time travel choice to be made by the showrunners of like, well, how does this function? Adding to it that you have, he's an elf. These elves live longer lives than humans as well. So how do you play all that out?
I thought as well there was something interesting in the fact that in the scene with Balor, he like lifts up Zachary, which I only noticed today on rewatch during the conjunction of the scare. Yeah, so he comes and he's the one who like lifts her up and supports her.
I don't know. I feel like we just have like more questions after our time with him and our time with Blood Origin that, fingers crossed, we will get to answer soon. And as we get to, I guess, the close of our discussion, do you guys happen to have like any last thoughts on Blood Origin episode 104 or Blood Origin in general?
I guess just that, it was a fun ride through Blood Origin, and looking forward to listening through the rest of the other episodes of Breakfast in Beauclair. Really excited to have been involved with a recording of an episode of the podcast. It was definitely a main reason I joined the Hansa to begin with, was to weasel my way into an episode.
And you did it! Yay!
Check. New Year's resolution completed.
It's only the 14th. You need a new one now.
Host the rest of the year.
Fair play. What about you, Lucy? Any last thoughts?
Enjoyed it. The recording and the show.
Short and sweet. So that is it for our show today. Danny, Lucy, thank you so much for joining me for this episode, and thank you to our Hansa for listening. So you can find both Danny and Lucy in the Hansa Discord. And Danny, where can people find you? And is there anything that our community can help you with, or anything that you would like to share with them?
I can be found on both Mixcloud and Instagram as Ordered Chaos Official, which is where I post DJ sets that I record, do the whole bedroom DJing thing, predominantly trance and dance music, a lot of remixes sort of thing. Doing a hobby that I do for myself. I play music I like listening to, and post it for those who enjoy it as well. Great for working out. Instagram's the place to go for all pictures of our dog Laszlo, as known in the Hansa.
Yes. Laszlo is an icon. We love Laszlo. He loves dress up, so we love him. And yeah, so actually, as this is the end of the season, we are going to be taking a break. So if you've gotten to the end of this and you are waiting for more episodes of Breakfast in Beauclair, in the meantime, you can find us, all of us, at bit.ly/the Hansa Discord. And you can hang out with us until we hit the next season of Breakfast in Beauclair while we're on the break. So next episode, join us as we kick off a new season of Breakfast in Beauclair with the next novel in Andrew Sapkowski's The Witcher series, Time of Contempt.
Thanks for joining us at The Breakfast Table. For show notes, transcripts of each episode, and a complete list of our social platforms and listening services, head over to breakfastinbeauclair.com. Breakfast in Beauclair is created by Alyssa from Good Morning. It's hosted by Alyssa with the Tidings from Toussaint, and sung by Alyssa Mitchell. The show is edited by Alyssa with music from Metro Filter Media. Breakfast in Beauclair is produced by Alyssa in New York City with Louise of Covier, the owner of the Trollish Porpoise, Katie the Redhead of Toussaint, Jacob E. Ava of Gulliby, Haven of the Age of the World, Charlotte from Megaward Glamour, Red Kite, the Original Roach, Connor's Cat, Libby, John Ripley, Tom from Australia, Jill Keith the Tabby Witch, Ollie from Sweden, James Carson III, Sally Side Sorcerer, Toussaint Knight, Miriam Witch Mary, and Softy. Special thanks to Danny and Lucy for joining us for this episode, and our international Hansa for their support.